You stand on the Cestius Bridge in the winter of 101 BC. The Tiber churns below, gray and indifferent. Before you, a naked man kneels on stone so cold it burns. He murdered his mother. Now Rome will murder him back, but not quickly. Never quickly. The executioners approach with a leather sack, and inside it something writhes. A dog, a rooster, a monkey, a viper, all alive, all starving. You watch as they beat him with blood-red rods until his spine becomes visible through torn flesh. Then they force him into the sack with the animals and sew it shut while he screams. The dog tears, the monkey claws, the snake strikes, and while he drowns in his own agony, they hurl the sack into the river. Cicero called it justice. History calls it ponecole, the punishment of the sack. And this is only the beginning. Before we go further, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching this from. It's incredible that people from Sydney to São Paulo, from Toronto to Tokyo, are all here right now, hungry for the truth history tried to bury. That's what this channel is about. The sack was merely one thread in a vast tapestry of terror. Rome perfected 12 methods of punishment, so elaborate, so psychologically devastating that even documenting them felt obscene. These were not the gladiatorial combats you learned about in school, not the legendary battles Hollywood loves to film. These were the punishments reserved for traitors, deserters, patricides, and impure vestals. The machinery of control that kept an empire obedient for 1,000 years. Seneca the Younger witnessed these executions firsthand and wrote, "I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman, because I have been among humans." He understood what most Romans refused to acknowledge, that these spectacles transformed the watchers as much as they destroyed the watched. Why did Rome invent such elaborate deaths? Because simple execution was never the point. Every torture was designed to send a message, and the message had to be unforgettable. The crime determined the punishment, and the punishment had to teach. This was not justice. This was propaganda written in human flesh, and every Roman citizen was required to read it. The philosopher Seneca provided the framework. Roman law divided punishments into 3 categories: capitis deminutio maxima, loss of citizenship and life; capitis deminutio media, loss of citizenship but not life; and capitis deminutio minima, loss of family rights. But within these legal categories existed a spectrum of cruelty that defied categorization. The 12 Tables, Rome's oldest legal code dating to 450 BC, established the foundation. The Lex Cornelia, Lex Julia, and dozens of subsequent legal reforms expanded the repertoire. By the height of the empire, Rome had systematized suffering into an art form. The jurist Ulpian, writing in the 3rd century A.D., catalogued these punishments with clinical precision in his Digesta. He ranked them by severity. Summa supplicia, ultimate punishments, included crucifixion, burning, and damnatio ad bestias. Media coercitio, moderate coercion, encompassed flogging and forced labor. Minima animadversio, minimal correction, meant fines and brief imprisonment. But these legal distinctions obscured a darker truth. Roman punishment was never merely about enforcing law. It was about displaying power, asserting control, and ensuring that every citizen understood their place in the social order. The condemned were transformed into object lessons. their bodies serving as textbooks from which the masses learned obedience. Archaeological evidence corroborates the literary record. Excavations at the Colosseum's hypogeum reveal the elaborate mechanical systems used to elevate animals and condemned prisoners into the arena. The Mamertine prison, Rome's most notorious dungeon, still bears scratches on its walls where prisoners clawed at stone. The Tarpeian Rock's base, when excavated in the 19th century, yielded layers of human remains compacted over centuries. These were not isolated incidents. They were systematic, institutionalized, and celebrated. Let us begin at the Tarpeian Rock, where Rome executed those who betrayed her from a cliff at the very heart of the city. The rock stood approximately 80 feet above the jagged stones below, on the southern summit of the Capitoline Hill. It overlooked the Roman Forum, where senators debated and citizens gathered, where the machinery of government ground forward each day. For Romans there was no more symbolic place to die. The location was deliberate. Every execution became a public spectacle visible to thousands, a reminder inscribed in falling bodies that treason carried consequences gravity itself would enforce. The rock was named after Tarpeia, a young woman who allegedly betrayed Rome to the Sabine king Titus Tatius during the city's earliest days. According to Livy's account, she agreed to open Rome's gates in exchange for what the soldiers wore on their left arms, meaning their golden bracelets. Instead, the Sabines crushed her beneath their shields, teaching Rome its first lesson about the price of treachery. Whether the story was true or merely foundational myth mattered less than its function. Every Roman knew the tale, and every Roman understood the warning. From that moment forward, the Tarpeian Rock became the designated execution site for Portuelio, high treason. The procedure was brutally simple. The condemned would be led through the forum in chains while crowds gathered. No ceremony preceded the execution. No priest offered prayers. The victim was simply thrust from the precipice, their bodies shattering on the rocks below in full view of Rome's civic center. The historian Livy records that in 384 B.C., Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, once a hero who had saved Rome from a Gallic invasion by hearing the sacred geese of Juno raise alarm, was hurled from the rock after being accused of aspiring to kingship. His crime was not merely ambition, but betraying the republican values Rome held sacred. The symbolism was devastating. The same cliff he had once defended became the instrument of his destruction. Plutarch, in his Life of Romulus, notes that the rock was used so frequently that its base became a place of accumulated bone and viscera. Archaeological excavations in the 1930s confirmed this, uncovering compacted layers of human remains suggesting centuries of executions. The bodies were deliberately left unburied, denied the funeral rites that Romans believed were necessary for the soul's passage to the underworld. This was spiritual annihilation accompanying physical destruction. Emperor Claudius reportedly attended these executions personally. Seneca, in a letter that drips with contempt, describes how the emperor would examine how the bodies had landed, taking what he called perverse pleasure in studying the angles of shattered limbs. The rock remained in use through the late Republic and into the Empire, though its function gradually shifted. By the imperial period, it was more often used for symbolic executions of particularly notable traitors whose deaths required maximum visibility. They could not look away, that was the point. Every senator walking to the Curia, every merchant conducting business in the Forum, Every citizen casting a vote or offering a sacrifice moved through a space marked by state violence. The Tarpeian Rock wasn't just an execution site. It was an ever-present reminder carved into the city's topography, a permanent installation of deterrence. But the rock was reserved for Roman citizens who had betrayed their own. For slaves, foreigners, and the lowest criminals, Rome had devised something far more prolonged and psychologically devastating: crucifixion. Crucifixion was so brutal that the Lex Julia explicitly exempted Roman citizens from it except in cases of military desertion. This punishment was reserved for those Rome considered beneath human dignity: slaves, pirates, rebels, and enemies of the state. The Roman orator Cicero called it crudelissimum taeterimum supplicium, the most cruel and disgusting punishment. Even he, who had no qualms about ordering executions, found crucifixion uniquely barbaric. The condemned would first be stripped naked, a humiliation designed to rob them of the last vestiges of dignity. Then came the flagellatio or verberatio, scourging with whips embedded with bone, metal, and glass. The flagrum was designed to tear flesh with each stroke. Victims often died during this preliminary torture. Those who survived were forced to carry the horizontal beam, the patibulum, through the streets to the execution site. The weight, typically between 40 and 60 pounds, became unbearable on a body already ravaged by scourging. Victims collapsed repeatedly while crowds jeered, spat, and pelted them with refuse. At the execution site, professional carnifex, executioners, drove iron nails through the wrists, not the palms, which could not support body weight. The feet were nailed or roped to the vertical post. Then the cross was raised, and the condemned was left to die. Death came slowly, usually from exhaustion and asphyxiation. To breathe, the victim had to push upward on the nailed feet, causing excruciating pain. Eventually, exhaustion made breathing impossible. The process could take hours or days. Roman executioners developed specialized techniques to prolong suffering. A small seat called a settle prevented victims from suffocating too quickly, extending the agony. Some crosses featured a suppedaneum, a footrest that served the same purpose. Seneca, who witnessed many crucifixions, wrote, "I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with head down to the ground. Some impale their private parts. Others stretch out their arms." The most infamous mass crucifixion occurred in 71 B.C., after the Third Servile War, when Marcus Licinius Crassus finally crushed Spartacus' slave rebellion. He ordered approximately 6,000 captured rebels crucified along the Via Appia, the main road from Rome to Capua. For over 200 kilometers, travelers passed thousands of dying men. Their agony was deliberately prolonged by skilled executioners who knew precisely how to prevent quick death. Plutarch records that the bodies remained on their crosses until they rotted away, months after the last screams had faded. Birds and dogs fed on the corpses while travelers passed by. Parents pointed them out to children as cautionary tales. Merchants calculated travel times by counting crucified bodies. About 300 crosses passed the milestone. The spectacle persisted long after Spartacus himself had died in battle. His body never recovered. The message was unmistakable. This is what becomes of those who raise arms against Rome. They could not look away. The Via Appia was one of Rome's busiest roads, traveled daily by merchants, soldiers, and government officials. For months, Roman power was visible in the form of 6,000 decomposing rebels, a forest of crucifixion along the empire's main artery. While crucifixion punished external enemies, Rome developed something equally terrifying for its own soldiers who failed in battle. Decimation, a punishment that forced brothers to kill brothers, decimatio. The word itself comes from the Latin decimus, meaning 10th. When a legion showed cowardice, mutiny, or catastrophic failure, they faced collective punishment designed to maximize psychological devastation while maintaining military effectiveness. The procedure was methodical and merciless. Soldiers would be divided into groups of 10, often men who had trained together, fought together, and eaten together for years. Each group would draw lots. The soldier who drew the shortest straw would be beaten to death by his 9 companions, not by executioners, not by centurions, by his own brothers in arms. They used fustuarium, clubs, and stones, raining blows upon a man they had called friend until his skull cracked and his body stopped twitching. The military historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century B.C., described the aftermath. Even those who manage to escape are not saved thereby. They are not allowed to return to their homes, and none of their family would dare receive such a man in the house. The survivors faced additional humiliation. They were forced to camp outside the safety of fortifications and subsist on barley instead of wheat, marking them as disgraced men unworthy of proper Roman rations. One of the most documented cases occurred in 71 B.C., the same year as Spartacus' defeat. A legion under the command of Mummius engaged the rebels against orders and suffered defeat. Crassus, determined to restore discipline, revived decimation, which had fallen out of common use. 500 men died at the hands of their comrades that day, their screams echoing across the camp as a lesson to the remaining legions. The military writer Frontinus noted that units which had been decimated often became Rome's fiercest fighters in subsequent battles, desperate to redeem themselves and eliminate the stigma of their punishment. The psychological impact was so severe that some soldiers chose to end their own lives rather than participate in killing their comrades. Others formed blood pacts, pledging not to survive if one of their group drew the fatal lot, desperate attempts to preserve humanity within an inherently dehumanizing system. The poet Lucan captured the horror in his epic Pharsalia. Chance became the arbiter of doom, and on the hazard of the lot depended death. But decimation, as terrible as it was, still offered 9 out of 10 soldiers survival. For individual military failures, Rome had devised something with no chance of escape. Fustuarium, the punishment of the clubs. A soldier who abandoned his post, lost his weapons, or showed individual cowardice faced fustuarium. The condemned would be led before his assembled legion, every man he had served beside forced to witness. The tribune would lightly touch him with a cudgel, a ceremonial gesture that served as the signal. Then every soldier fell upon him with clubs and stones. The public nature was crucial. It forced soldiers to participate in the killing, making them complicit. After witnessing or delivering such brutality, they would never consider desertion themselves. The military writer Vegetius noted that this punishment created such terror that facing the enemy in battle became less daunting than the certainty of death at the hands of one's own comrades. They could not look away. The entire legion was required to witness and participate. The punishment transformed every soldier into both enforcer and potential victim, creating a web of complicity that bound the military structure together. From military punishments we turned to spectacles designed for entertainment. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The Colosseum's underground network, the hypogeum, contained 32 animal pens and 80 vertical shafts. Trap doors allowed beasts and condemned prisoners to appear magically in the arena, creating theatrical entrances that heightened audience excitement. These executions were often staged as mythological reenactments, grotesque parodies that blurred entertainment and execution. A criminal might be dressed as Orpheus and sent into the arena with a lyre, promised that his music might soothe the wild beasts. For a brief moment, the animals would seem calm. Then a bear would be released and maul him to death, creating a bloody inversion of the myth. Another might be dressed as Icarus, hoisted on wires, then dropped into a pit of bears. The poet Martial witnessed such spectacles and praised them in verse. Whatever fame sings of, the arena presents to you. This place provides its own belief. During Emperor Trajan's celebration of his Dacian victories in 107 AD, games lasted 123 days. 11,000 animals were killed alongside thousands of condemned criminals and prisoners of war. Lions were starved for days before release, driving them into frenzy. Bears were goaded with hot irons until they became mindless with rage. The unpredictability of whether the beast would strike fast or toy with its prey kept the stands howling for more. The crowd cheered as men were torn apart. Vendors sold wine and snacks. Children watched from their parents' shoulders. People placed bets on how long each victim would scream. This was lunch entertainment, a casual backdrop to an afternoon at the games. They could not look away. The Colosseum seated 50,000, and attendance was expected. Emperors used these spectacles to maintain public favor. Missing the games could mark someone as suspect, potentially disloyal. The populace wasn't merely entertained by violence. They were trained by it, conditioned to accept that Rome's enemies died for their amusement. But Rome had refined fire itself into an instrument of prolonged agony. Vivi crematio, burning alive, held religious meaning in Rome. Fire was believed to purify crimes that polluted the community. After the Great Fire of 64 AD, Emperor Nero transformed execution into spectacle. Christians were coated in pitch and wax, burning slowly as living torches that illuminated his gardens. Tacitus wrote that some were crucified, some torn by dogs, others burned to light the night, while Nero performed among them. Ironically, Nero's gardens later became the site of St. Peter's Basilica, turning a place of martyrdom into Christianity's holiest ground. Rome also used trained elephants for executions. Pliny the Elder described beasts taught to kill on command, crushing victims limb by limb. During the Punic Wars, captured Carthaginian generals were sometimes killed beneath elephants trained to attack enemy colors, reenacting Roman victories. For Rome's greatest enemies, death was not enough. Damnatio memoria erased identity itself. Names were chiseled from monuments, statues destroyed or recarved, coins melted, wills voided. Emperor Domitian suffered this fate after his assassination in 96 AD. The paradox remains. We remember him because the erasure was so visible. The most symbolic punishment was pona kali for parricide. Beaten, sewn into a sack with a dog, rooster, monkey, and viper, the condemned was thrown into water, denied earth, air, sun, and burial. Cicero said this stripped the murderer of all elements of life. Other terrors followed: scaphism, slow roasting by fire, and the live burial of Vestal virgins. Rome's punishments were performances of power. The ruins remain, silent reminders that civilizations built on terror eventually collapse beneath their own cruelty. They warn future generations that normalized brutality corrodes morality, authority, memory, and humanity itself, leaving monuments without meaning forever behind. They remind us that spectatorship numbs conscience, that law can become theater, and that obedience forged through fear is always fragile. When violence is ritualized, empathy withers. What survives is stone, story, and warning. Power without restraint devours itself, and history records not strength, but suffering remembered long after empires